Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Pratham Babaria, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Science. My guest tonight is a professor of organic chemistry at the Department of Chemistry and Material Science at Aalto University. He received his PhD in organic chemistry in 2018 and is the current holder of the prestigious Compa Chair. He's also an exemplary science communicator, and I know this firsthand since he's my professor. So please welcome Dr. Siitonen. How are you, sir?
Good. Another busy day, even though it's supposed to be kind of a national holiday.
Right. Yeah, and thank you so much, Dr. Siitonen, for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. And I know it's been an extremely busy week, so I'm really happy that you were able to take out some time to speak with me today.
Oh, no worries. Anytime.
Sure. Of course. So I guess we could just jump straight into the meaty parts of this podcast. And so the first section, I really want to talk about your inspiration and how you got into chemistry in the first place. So The first question is really kind of short, yet I feel that it bears considerable importance. So how is it that you got interested in chemistry, and how did you get interested in science in general?
This is a fantastic question because I really don't know the answer to it. I've read my parents' diaries when I was a kid, and when I was 4 years old, and I don't have any recollection of this, I started mixing things in like empty jars and glasses, like milk and juice and stuff like this. And I told my parents that I'm going to be a scientist when I grow up. I guess it must have come from like movies or cartoons or something like that. I kind of picked up this picture of a scientist from there, and then thought it looks really cool. And then I just never stopped doing it. And I kind of started with like trying to do chemistry, but of course it's really hard to get any kind of interesting reactions out of household materials. So kind of quickly, I remember that like when I was 7, I got interested in electronics, and I started learning electronics, building small circuits, fixing small appliances like our TV at the time. This was in 1997 or something like that. So the stuff was actually still fixable back then. And then kind of quickly, I also got into programming, and I started writing software as well. But then out of all of these options, I kind of eventually settled in on doing chemistry, mostly because of the creative aspect of it. But there would have been a really good chance that I would be actually in game programming, and I guess I would be making more money writing games at this point. But
yeah, well, that's really interesting. So science is really claimed to be, and undoubtedly is, the tool that allows us to make sense of the world around us. And it's really the backbone of science that enables us to do this curious, skeptical thinking. So how is it that you develop these skills to think about the world, and how did you become curious in general?
I think I wouldn't want to say that it's natural, but you kind of get hooked on it. So you see an interesting thing. I was kind of as a kid, and I still kind of am. I'm after these kinds of curious discoveries, like seeing something for the first time. It's kind of an exploratory thing, and humans are, I guess, curious, naturally curious. So I think it really comes from the fascination with the unknown, and being the first person to actually accomplish something that drives the curiosity. But it really boils down to curiosity and also kind of creativity. You can express yourself, even though science is often seen as this kind of rigorous, and it is a rigorous system, but there's a lot that goes on that basically involves creativity, and also kind of you need to be a bit lucky as well while you're doing these things.
Of course.
And I still remember certain like points in my career where I've held a test tube or seen a circuit work or something, and when like, gosh, now it works, and you kind of get an endorphin rush out of it, and then you keep getting to more and more complicated problems and trying to crack those.
Right. And I always feel like a scientist is essentially a child that's never lost their curiosity. They always try to figure out ways to understand the nature of the world to the point where they become destructive at times. So, when children are young, they'll tip over vases, they'll ruin the carpet, they'll come back from jumping on in puddles outside on a rainy day and walk on the carpet. So these are things that children are always experimenting. They're trying to figure out how the world works. And a scientist is essentially learning how to solve problems with the same set of curiosity that they never lost. Would I be right in saying that?
I think that's a very good description. I unfortunately know of many scientists who would not be happy with it, but I'm very happy with the description. It is really the kind of curiosity, and sometimes it's just a matter of trying things out. Many of the biggest discoveries are results of you trying to do something completely different. And then if you're actually curious and you analyze your results carefully, you realize that, oh, actually something completely different happened, and this is way more interesting than the thing that we were originally after. And this kind of childlike curiosity really drives science forward.
Right. Yeah. So I guess now we can move on to some of the more so-called important parts of the podcast. So first, I want to know a little bit about some of the ongoing research that you're doing. So I know that you lead the experimental and theoretical organic synthesis group at Aalto University. What is the goal of that group, and what do you do?
So to put it simply, we're trying to make molecules. That's essentially my business. The problem is that, like, all around us we have matter, but most of that matter is not in its original form. We have to rearrange those atoms to turn it into new types of stuff. And it's really the ultimate question of how to kind of manipulate matter to turn it to do whatever you want. How do you turn oil into drugs, or how do you turn oil into organic LEDs or something like that? And we're doing this in the context of organic, so mostly carbon-based molecules. This is because carbon has sufficiently predictable reactivity that over the last around 100 years, we've managed to rationally understand and develop certain sets of rules, mostly nowadays based on quantum mechanics. Earlier, they were just empirical observations, but now we actually understand this, and we can use it effectively as a building block in chemistry. So it's one of the few elements that allows us to engineer on nanoscale, if you will, where the predictability is there. Of course, compared to traditional engineering, where you're trying to make something, you need to manipulate the object somehow, either 3D print it or remove stuff from it. You have a whole bunch of methods. But when we're building molecular structures and we're trying to make molecules, we don't see them, and we kind of have to just coax them to do whatever we want in the flask spontaneously. And that requires a lot of predictive power. And that's why I'm kind of in this field of organic synthesis, because we can design extremely elaborate multi-step synthetic routes, which will eventually work and lead to the desired structure. And it's basically, well, as a kid, I really liked building from Legos. I still do. And some people compare it to molecular Legos. I don't like to compare it directly, because with Legos, you can see if you build something wrong. But in chemical sense, everything looks like an oil or crystalline substance. And then you actually have to figure out what the molecular structure of the thing is. But essentially, it's the creativity of the synthesis that we are after, trying to make things more efficiently and understand how these synthesis procedures actually work. What's going on with the molecules? What are they doing when they are transforming from one molecule to another?
Nice. So what sorts of results has your group come up with that are important or really substantial?
I think so most of my inspiration actually comes from nature itself. So we're trying to kind of benchmark our current synthetic skills, our skills as humanity, trying to make materials and molecules. We're probing it against known molecules, because if you can basically make any molecule you want, but we choose our targets, like the things that we actually want to synthesize in the lab, we choose those from nature. And the reason is that we know that those molecules exist, and often they have biological activities. So we're after these kinds of natural molecules, and we try to replicate them in the lab, like one-on-one synthesis that needs to be exactly replicated. And as of late, last year, we completed the total synthesis of indicate indolene C, which is a really interesting natural product isolated from indica plants, the same plants we used to use to dye our genes. Nowadays, we synthesize indigo industrially. We synthesized that and actually managed to complete it in just 2 synthetic steps, which is quite a feat. It's a reasonably complex beast. So we're trying to figure out the best way of making this. So that was kind of impressive. And just this year, together with our undergraduate researcher, Anavi Serna, a brilliant researcher, she completed a total synthesis of acetygeramine 1, which it was isolated in 1990s. And since then, no one has even dared to touch the molecule because I think people just thought that it's too complicated. But we cracked the code and we actually managed to synthesize it in the lab. So these are some of the kind of highlights of the recent highlights. We are always after a certain molecule, and once we get it done, then we know that it's done dusty. We publish it, and then we celebrate a bit, and then we look at the second interesting molecule that we want to make.
Wow, that sounds really fancy and really interesting, I must say. So what type of people really participate in this research? Is it just scientists and experimentalists, or do you have a collaborative with engineers and computer scientists and grad students, or even some undergraduate students?
So during my stay here at Rice, I've mostly been working with undergraduate researchers. Mm-hmm. Now at Aalto, I will be having a full-blown group, so postdoctoral researchers and graduate students. And really, my own interest also, it not only lies in making these things, but actually understand why the stuff that we do in the lab actually works, which entails that we need to do quantum mechanical studies of these molecules. So we do a reasonable amount of collaboration with computational scientists, and I've basically, because of my programming background, I've been writing my own software and so on to analyze these reactions too. So we are kind of the old-time ideal of a natural scientist doing kind of everything. I think it's coming back, and it's coming back very strongly. So you can't just start doing something and then just stick to your guns and not learn other skills. But nowadays it's becoming ever more prominent that you kind of need to have skills in everything. So for example, now I'm looking for master students who would basically have a math degree instead of a chemistry degree, because we are looking so deeply into the mathematical foundations of essentially, you can take a molecule. It's a collection of atoms, and then bonds really don't exist, but we can fake them. They're a useful model. So they're connected with bonds. And that's essentially what it is, mathematically speaking. It's a graph.
Right.
So you can shove graph theory into chemistry, and then you can derive some really cool results. So I think these kinds of interdisciplinary areas are where really the newest innovations and understanding comes from.
Of course. And in general, I feel like it's when multiple different fields intersect that real innovation happens. Like, for example, I was just reading about computational biology the other day, and I realized that if you had just a strong focus in computer science, then you probably wouldn't have arrived at the field of computational biology. Or if you had a very strong focus in biology, then you wouldn't have converged at that new field. But it's when you sort of try to gain an understanding of multiple different fields, you work with people of different fields, that true innovation and true technological progress occurs. Am I correct in saying that, sir?
Yeah, I would highly agree with that. And oftentimes, what I've seen is that the tools from one field, when they are applied to another field, it will immediately solve like a decade-old problem in that field, but no one has just ever seen this tool to work. The good example of this is Frances Arnold. She won the Nobel Prize on biocatalysis, and she's an engineer by training. And she essentially took her engineering training and the kind of optimization ideas that she had from strict engineering degrees, and when applied to biocatalysis and chemistry, proved to be worth a Nobel Prize. Her research is absolutely fantastic, just because she's approaching it probably from a more engineering perspective than a typical biochemist or a chemist would.
Right. And what do you think about the Nobel Prize in Chemistry that was awarded this year?
Oh, yes, that's actually near and dear to my heart. So I know Benjamin List, and we've exchanged emails as well. And David Macmillan is a huge inspiration. I've written a book chapter on organocatalysis as a graduate student. Mm-hmm. My master's project was on organocatalytic total synthesis, and then finally my PhD was also on using organocatalysts to effectively synthesize these kinds of natural products. So I'm really happy with, well, first things first, it being fundamental chemistry, because some people always criticize the biology aspect. I don't mind that, but this was really pure organic chemistry on a rather fundamental level.
Wow, really interesting.
And also it's been interesting to see how like BBC and other CNN and so on have been trying to report what asymmetric organocatalysis is.
Right, yeah, and it's really heartwarming to see that science once in a while appears in the news, because in the news we see so many different stories about politics and us tribalizing into different factions, warring against each other, and we sometimes forget about human progress in general. And science is really the epitome of that. It symbolizes human progress. So, whenever I see something like a Nobel Prize being awarded or some prestigious award being offered to some researchers, I feel very strongly that we're moving forward in the right direction.
Yep, that's because there are some criticisms that might be warranted towards the Nobel Prize, which is that, is it really the professor who earned it, or is it the research group? But I think that in the future, they will probably change it so that it goes to a field and then they just won't nominate these people. So I think it's sometimes it glorifies this image of a genius professor, but very often it's actually the postdoctoral research and the graduate students who have the best ideas to actually execute them in the lab. But it's still very positive that the Nobel Prizes are kind of viewed as something that people follow and see it as being interesting or useful.
Right, sure. And now I really want to ask you, what is the typical day in the life of a scientist like you, and specifically an organic chemist?
So with organic chemistry, there's this kind of a transition period that I'm currently in, because I'm turning into PI in a research group. But as a graduate student, for example, in organic chemistry, it's heavily lab-based. So almost every day we are running at least several synthetic experiments, trying to make progress. Let's say that we are trying to make a natural product. We might be making the first intermediate molecules. Usually it means that we need to make a molecule, then turn that into a new molecule, and so on. Then we have the forefront of the synthesis, where we are running the steps that we haven't established. And usually the days are either just making a ton of the starting material so that you can actually experiment on the front line of the synthesis, or then you're tinkering with like a few milligrams of material to see if the front line works. So it's very heavily lab-based, but now that it kind of transitions so the more senior you become, the less you actually spend time in the lab, the more time you spend teaching these things.
And I guess so for supervising your
yeah.
Yeah, great.
Exactly. Supervising, applying money. So it's kind of diverse in the sense that, well, I guess this holds for any field that no day is like, but now I can clearly see that most of my time, compared to being a graduate student, a postdoctoral scholar, most of my time is spent actually on writing things, writing emails, writing funding applications, writing papers, and writing to collaborators on the recent results. And it's kind of a shame in a sense, because I've spent 10 years becoming highly skilled in the experimental sense. So that's why I usually want to go to the lab to help people anyways, to kind of just spread some of the knowledge that I've gained over the years.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, very interesting. And I'm sure all of that lab work will culminate into something really important. And I hope to see your name in the list of top-notch researchers in the future. So now I guess I want to move on to a new section that's really about the future of science in general, the future of chemistry. So given that you and your team and all these wonderful people are conducting all this dynamic, interesting research, what is the future of science and research? How will it impact broadly the world?
So the big problem is that we have managed to generate, as humanity, we have managed to generate so many global problems that science is basically, now we're just trying to use science as a tool of solving these impeding doom type problems that we have. And I think that's okay as well. But for many of these kinds of bigger problems, it's really the applied science that could counter our help. And we shouldn't really sacrifice the front line of fundamental research, because that will fuel the solution to the next generation problems.
Right.
But for the future of science, I think really, as I mentioned, the interdisciplinary nature will become ever more prominent. Other things that I'm clearly seeing, and I've seen throughout my career as well, is that the sheer computational power that we have at our disposal keeps increasing and increasing. And the computational tools are becoming ever more sophisticated. So now we had, for example, the latest protein folding competition that was organized. Now these tools are getting really freaking good. So I think very quickly things become more fast-paced. Essentially, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Right.
also another problem really with this is that the amount of research that gets published is going to skyrocket. It's already skyrocketing. So it's really hard to keep pace with the latest discoveries. There are probably like hundreds and hundreds of papers just in the field of organic chemistry that get published every day. So there's no way that you can actually keep up to date with that. So, but I also in that line, I think these kinds of more selective and filtered tools will become something that we use every day. So just instead of having an RSS feed, it would actually somehow pick and choose the things that you might be interested.
Right. And it seems like the computational sciences are in fact advancing very, very quickly. So they might play a very important role in solving some of these problems. And, one thing that's certain is that humanity is heading towards very unpredictable times. For one, we had the advent of the current raging pandemic, and then we are due to face the consequences of things like human-caused climate change. So what sorts of specific developments do you think science or some specific scientific field like chemistry might be able to come up with?
So I think in terms of chemistry, I can I can say at least a few, at least in terms of preparative chemistry, I can say at least a few words. So really the problem is that, especially from a synthetic, like a preparative chemistry perspective, is that we need to make stuff. There's no way around that. We need to make materials. We need to make molecules. The main raw source of materials thus far has been oil. And oil is mostly just completely deoxygenated hydrocarbons who might have a double bond here or there, but they are essentially unfunctional feedstocks. And what's going on now is that as we are shifting away from oil and we are moving towards more biorenewables, the big problem is that the feedstock molecules change quite a bit. So if we look at cellulose, for example, it is really dense in stereochemistry. It has a lot of isomeric possibilities that simply do not exist, and we need to deal with that problem. It has a lot of oxygens in it, and that's a huge problem because our tools, our large-scale manufacturing tools for making molecules, operate really well on the oil-based materials, and we know how to synthesize stuff from those. But now we need to develop new types of chemistry that can actually feed on these completely different types of molecules and use those as the raw feedstocks for production. So that's definitely one of the key things that needs to change. We need to develop essentially new types of tools, and biology in this sense is of course highly useful. That's from an organic chemistry perspective. But then thinking about recycling in general is that what we effectively would want to have at our disposal is a perfect circular economy. So nothing gets thrown out. Everything we produce would be reused in one way or another. This is especially prominent with isolation of rare metals, because metals themselves, well, you just dig them out of the ground, no big deal. But the industry actually consumes a huge amount of energy and burns a lot of oil, leaves behind huge eco catastrophes and so on. Whereas I think in the future, like not in the near future, but in kind of 100 years from now, the most valuable resource on Earth will be trash, especially like all sorts of old electronic appliances. People will be scavenging for those. And we are already selling trash around the globe. We are shipping trash, electrical trash, so we could actually isolate gold and other valuable materials from there. And especially now that we had the shortage caused by several things, including the one ship that got stuck, we saw that our kind of feedstocks on some of these materials are really thin. So things might break really easily. And some of the, for example, metals that we use in, let's say, production of medicine, like iridium, and we also use certain things for production of batteries, the prices shift immensely, and that is not sustainable. So we probably need to have more sustainable and more reliable tools for this process as well. Also, chemical industry and production of materials consumes a ton of energy as well. So if you could run a reaction, and this kind of ties back to development of catalysts as well, we need to also focus on development of new catalysts. Because if you have to run a reactor at 100 degrees centigrade, or you could run it at room temperature, you would be saving a lot of money in the long run, right, and also not burning as much energy in the process.
Right. So I guess these are all sort of energy efficient solutions to and utilizing trash. That was a very interesting thing that I had not thought of that before, of course. Yeah, and so now I sort of have another question, and it's more about a futuristic perspective, piggybacking on some of the other questions I asked you. So since you're a scientist and you obviously have this childlike curiosity and wonder, what do you think about the expansion of humanity out into the cosmos? Do you think we will one day colonize other planets? And I know you're not a physicist or an astronomer, but as a scientist, what do you think about this?
I think it's perfectly, like, if we would actually put our resources into it, we could probably, well, and we're already planning on going to Mars for the first exploratory things. So definitely it is doable, but based on what I've seen and what I've read, because I'm kind of broadly interested in science in general, I'm not an expert, but it seems as if humanity reaches or civilization reaches the certain technological finesse, then, well, at least it's built into humans, this kind of internal greed that wants more and more, and the consumption is kind of getting out of hand as we speak. It's really a matter of if, I guess this is also discussed in some of these theories where people talk about if a society can go over, or a civilization can go over a certain threshold on their own planet, then yes, they can do it. And I think we are now looking at that threshold for humanity, because if we can solve the most impeding problems with climate change and food production, clean water, these kinds of huge questions where chemistry will of course play a pivotal role, I think we will be able to do it. But it's really a matter of getting over that boundary where things are working in a highly sophisticated society in a way where we can actually spare the resources to do something as large as colonizing other planets.
Right. And I guess in order to actually enact some of these solutions that you named and exploring other planets, we need to make a very strong educational system and really inspire students to go into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math fields. So I sort of want to digress from the topic of chemistry and focus on that important subject, which is education. What sort of changes do you think need to be enacted in education to ensure that students are truly the recipients of a transformative educational experience?
So I think one of the biggest things, and this is especially prominent in science, is that we seem to have this perception that science is void of emotions and feelings. And we think that science is the idealized picture of a scientist, is this kind of a cold-hearted, old white guy is locked away in a basement lab, but that's not how it works. It's a diverse field with diverse people, people from various backgrounds. And unless we make it available to everyone, and unless everyone can feel connected to the subject matter, it's simply not going to, we don't have the resources to waste our best people. We need to have everyone on board. So it really is a matter of inclusion and making people feel like they belong, and also developing an emotional connection with the subject matter, right, so that instead of just crunching through numbers, the numbers would have a meaning. They would be there for a reason. And by providing these kind of positive experiences, and really one of the key culprits, and this is of course changing as we speak as well, but the shift from, this is kind of provocative thought, but I think that you can't teach anyone anything, right, because actually learning is something that has to be internalized. You have to kind of, the stuff has to click in your head. You can provide the resources, you can provide the environment, and you can kind of be the catalyst for that learning process. But really the shift from a teacher-focused education to more student-focused education is at the heart of all of this.
Right. And, you know, a lot of critics have voiced their concern to an environment in science classrooms where testing is more emphasized than actual learning. What do you think about it? Do you think the standardization of tests is really a good way to teach students?
Not really, no. So in terms of crunching through the numbers and getting, because like you can't quantify a person with just a single number. It is absolutely impossible. And actually the history of this kind of grading, it dates back to industrialization, where people tried to turn schools into these kinds of optimized factories, where you'd be able to quantify who's good and who's bad and so on. So it wasn't, the grading system wasn't really even built to enhance learning, but rather to optimize schools. So instead of moving, I think moving away from this kind of grading and standardized exams, really homework problems and these kinds of problems where you get a ton of feedback and we can actually improve on what you did and you can see how to improve, is much more valuable than just doing a test. And to be frank, I've been to several tests and then the next day I can't remember anything and I still get a really high grade. And I think at that point it kind of proves the point that it's you can have good exams as well. I'm not saying that, but
right.
I've also been to exams where I felt like I learned nothing, but I memorized a whole ton of stuff that I completely forgot the next day.
Right, of course. And I guess a lot of students have the concern that, when they go into a testing room, they just forget half of the things that they learned. It's really hard because of anxiety and
yeah.
It's really difficult for them to apply those things. We have the SAT exam here, which is highly antagonized by both students and teachers. So hopefully we'll make a shift away from that and we'll try to teach students actually what's going on and inculcate a culture of real learning, questioning, thinking, and skepticism in them so that they can learn by themselves.
Exactly. I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Anyway, sir, thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this. It really means a lot to me, and I will see you again soon.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. Take care. Bye.
You too.